I did a house call a couple of years ago in Pueblo, and the lady was in her 90s and she'd passed away, and she had over 200 boxes of Jell-O in her kitchen because you never knew if you needed that one Jell-O, and she had cases and cases of soda pop on her kitchen floor that had been so long on the kitchen floor that the soda had leaked through the bottom of the cans. They were all empty, and there were impressions all over her kitchen floor of cases and cases of soda. And so, people did what they had to do. From 1946 to 1957, my mother and father and my brothers and sisters and I lived in the Archie Musick art studio cottage, which was right on the southeastern edge of the Garden of the Gods, right at the end of Studio Place. And it was built by Archie Musick beginning in about 1926, and it started off as a small little shack. And by 1946, it was a white stucco, two-level, about 600 square foot cottage. The lower level was the living room, and at night, the living room turned into my parents' bedroom. And on the upper level, you went up a flight of cement stairs to a landing, and there was a little tiny dining room area. And right next to that was our kitchen. And then to the west of the kitchen, we had two bedrooms, one for my two brothers and I, and the other one for my four sisters. It wasn't what you call made for a family to live in for 11 years. It was Archie's art studio. And Archie lived up the hill in his lovely home, a beautiful home that he had built for his wife, Pat, and their two kids, Dan and Pat. Sorry, his wife, Irene, who's like a second mother to me. That's why I forgot her name, Pat. Anyway, we had an outdoor privy. We didn't have indoor plumbing, and for 2 years we didn't have a sink, but my mother did fetch water down the hill from a pump at the bottom of our driveway. And so we had water. We just didn't have it in the house, so it was not a big deal. And we had a bathroom. It was just outside, not inside. And in the kitchen, my mother cooked on a beautiful black and blue cast iron wood-burning stove that Archie had put in the house. It was it was state-of-the-art for 1905. But it was a beautiful stove, and it put off a lot of heat. And she, being a Minnesota girl and had grown up as the daughter of a freight traffic manager for the Northern Pacific, she didn't really know much about the rustic country life, but she learned in a big hurry how to build a fire, and then how to bank a fire, and then how to start it back up in the morning, and you never had to put it out. If you knew what you were doing, you could keep it going 24 hours a day with a little bit of coal and a little bit of wood. And we didn't have central heat. We had a coal or an oil-fired furnace in the living room where my parents slept, and in each one of the bedrooms there was a little oil-fired heater. But the stove in the kitchen gave off plenty of heat for the dining room and for the kitchen, and actually I slept right next to the kitchen, so I was always nice and toasty warm. My mother and father had both been through the Depression in different ways. My mother had had a pretty good life until the Depression, and her father, working for the railroad, he had wanted to send her to music school. She was an accomplished pianist, and she spoke French. She played the organ also, but he couldn't send her to college. They just didn't have the money, and she ended up going to California to live with her aunt and working in his art gallery. My father, on the other hand, said that the Depression didn't really affect him that much in the pocketbook because he had so many professions. He did so many things that he always had money in his pocket. And he lived by his wits, and he lived on the road, and when he could hop a freight, he'd hop a freight. And when railroad detective would make him buy a ticket, then he'd buy a ticket. So our 11 years in the music studio were very, very interesting. We didn't have hardly any money. My dad had to put all of his money back into the book business. But we had a guardian angel, two guardian angels, Irene and Archie Musick. And they let us live there for practically nothing. I think the rent was $20 a month. And so my parents would scrimp and save, and my dad collected string. He had balls of twine. He collected paper clips, thumbtacks, tape. That's right, pieces of wood, rubber bands. He'd save rubber bands for 5 years, and after 5 years, the rubber band isn't any good. But that didn't mean he didn't save it, because you could always use it for something. And my mother was a wonderful cook. And because of what we were able to afford to eat, we had a lot of pork and beans and a lot of canned vegetables. But we also had, my father was Danish, and so my mother wanted us to make sure we knew all about Danish heritage and what the Danes ate and what their traditions were. And so one of my father's favorite dishes was rugbrød, a brown soup made from old pumpernickel bread, lemons, cinnamon sticks, salt, and heavy cream. And she would make it in a pot, and it fed a lot of people. You could make a lot of rugbrød for kids, and it was filling, and it was not my favorite. And I disappointed my sister. I told her I really didn't like it. Oh, you didn't? Oh, no. It was kind of lumpy, and so if you think of something lumpy and it's in a bowl and it's brown, it doesn't look like food. Well, yeah, the lemon helped and the cinnamon sticks, and what would you do? You'd put it in the bowl, and then you'd pour cream in the middle of it, and then with your spoon you dip it into the rugbrød, get a little bit of cream and a little bit of the brown stuff, and it made it palatable. You could eat it. It was, and at Christmas time, if we were fortunate, we would get a goose or a couple of geese for Christmas dinner. And a goose is a very fat bird, and it would melt down. The fat would just fill the bottom of the pan, and my mother saved everything. She never threw anything away, so we made a sandwich spread from goose fat that she would then add onions and apples to. It was called gossefat, and it was our sandwich spread, and we'd put it on bread, and that's what I would take to Whittier Elementary. And my classmates would have bologna and white bread, and I'd have gossefat on pumpernickel, and so I sat in the corner a lot eating my lunch. But I had a wonderful childhood. Our backyard was the Garden of the Gods, and we picked wild onions and choke cherries and wild sugar plums and asparagus. And the wild onions in the Garden of the Gods grew everywhere. I don't know if there's any now, but they grew everywhere. And you could make a nice pot of soup with the wild onions and pick a few young dandelions and make a nice salad. And it was wonderful. And my mother would, at dinner time, she would tuck the napkins all the way around our necks because we might have to wear that shirt the next day to school. And so you needed to keep the shirt clean, or you weren't going to have a clean shirt. And we didn't have a lot of clothes. We bought our clothes at Sally's. My father called it Sally's, Salvation Army. So that was kind of how it was growing up in the garden. But before I forget, I want to tell you a little bit about my father. He was, he was Danish. He was born in April of 1902 in Brooklyn, New York. And he was the son of an orchestra conductor. My grandfather, whom I never met, who died before my mother even met him, was with the New York Symphony Orchestra under Walter Damrosch. And Damrosch was one of the modern. He was on a committee, I think, with John Philip Sousa, and they put down the final notes to the Star Spangled Banner. They put them on paper, and to finalize the modern version of the Star Spangled Banner that became the official national anthem in 1933. And so my grandfather was his first chair, first violin in the New York Symphony Orchestra for 6 years, and then he went on to conduct his own orchestra, the Danish American Symphony Orchestra in New York, before he died. So my father grew up as an only child and in New York, and he traveled with his parents. He went to every opera and every performance of Beethoven and Chopin, and everywhere his parents went, he went with them, and if they had to go to a concert, he was there. So he grew up with classical music. And he learned, and he spoke Danish and English and passable Norwegian and Swedish and a hell of a lot of German. So he could converse in many different languages. So the time that he spent in New York was very fruitful. But he did drop out of high school in the 10th grade. He was bored with high school. He needed to go to work. So he became a professional wrestler in 1920. He had wrestled with the Amateur Athletic Union in 1919, and he made it to the semifinals. And so as a welterweight, 5'7", 148 pounds, he entered the professional wrestling game, and his first match was in Port Jefferson, New York, in April of 1920. His opponent was a guy by the name of Joe Salami. And Mr. Salami was the hometown favorite. This was a benefit for the fire department in Port Jefferson, New York. And my father had strict instructions to lose the match. It was fixed in 1920. It was just as phony as it is today. And he got overexcited, and he beat Mr. Salami. And he got in big trouble after the match, and learned really quick if he wanted to stay in the wrestling game, he needed to follow orders, and when it was time to take a fall, you took a fall. Sometimes he would get his last-minute instructions in the ring from the referee. Okay, Clausen, you're going down in 10, and he's going to throw you, whatever. Or, so out of 1,132 professional matches that he wrestled, 2 were on the level. And the first one, and then he was wrestling a Japanese contortionist who didn't understand English and hadn't gotten the instructions that he was supposed to lose, and he practically wore my father out. He tried everything to pin this guy, and he kept getting out of all these holds he was in. And so finally, my dad says, well, somebody in the audience who spoke Japanese had a little palaver with the other wrestler, and they figured things out, and he took a fall and lost the match like he was supposed to. So he came through Colorado Springs with one of the carnivals he wrestled with. He wrestled back and forth across the country, north, south, east, and west, everywhere. And he came through Colorado Springs in 1926 with a carnival. And the promoter was a fellow by the name of Abe Marylander. Well, on one of his days off, because he was there for a couple of weeks, he was hiking on Pikes Peak. And on the peak, he would sing opera at the drop of a hat anytime he could. And he was singing an opera, walking along the bar trail, and lo and behold, somebody answered him with the same opera. He would sing a few notes, and then somebody would sing a few more notes. And they finally met on the trail, and it turned out that fellow was Archie Musick. And they became fast friends after that. And he and Archie rode the freights a few times. And one of the other things I forgot to mention, my dad wasn't just a professional wrestler. He also became an artist model in New York. And he modeled for Thomas Hart Benton and Jackson Pollock and Diego Rivera and Gutzon Borglund anybody who came through New York and was teaching or taking lessons at the Art Students League probably drew my father with no clothes on. Not the people drawing, my dad, okay? I got to be careful about that. And Archie went to New York and studied under Thomas Art Benton. And so with my dad's wrestling career and with his modeling career, he also then got a few bit parts in movies in Hollywood, in the silent movies. He wrestled in the ring. He wrestled the first silent movie, Tarzan, a fellow by the name of Elmo Lincoln. And he wrestled another guy who was an escape artist that you might know of, Harry Houdini. He wrestled him several times. When he trained in New York at Bothner's Gymnasium, the best wrestlers on the East Coast would come through New York City and train at Bothner's Gymnasium. And he'd wrestle heavyweights and middleweights, and he'd wrestle anybody, actors, other welterweights. He ended up wrestling Douglas Fairbanks Sr. He also was he had a bit part in one of Douglas Fairbanks Sr.'s movies. He was a pirate, and he had so much makeup. I've watched the movie. I've found a copy. I can't tell who he is. He's one of 100 different guys. And when he wasn't wrestling, when he wasn't modeling or acting in the movies, he was a tuna fisherman. He managed to, and during Prohibition, his buddy Lee Jarvis, who owned a tuna boat, would sail down to Mexico and dock in a Mexican port and load liquor into the bottom of the boat in cases, where the fish go. And then they would fish their way back to San Diego with a full load of tuna. And the inspector would say, "Oh, nice tuna. Yes, very good. Okay, you're good." And then when the coast was clear, they'd unload the tuna and the contraband booze. And I just found that out. I had no idea my father was a rum runner, but oh well. In 1932, he got a job as a newspaper reporter to cover the 32 Olympics in L.A. for the Danish press in New York. In 1935, he decided he was going to write an article and expose the wrestling game for being the fake that it was. And that effectively ended his career, strangely enough. His last bout was in San Luis Obispo, California in 1935. And he lost after 30 minutes. It was a decision, and he was told, "Okay, you're losing." And so he continued to model, however, and he worked for the WPA. And so he did all these things, and so he was never without a dollar in his pocket. So the Depression didn't really affect him that much, he said. But he saw the 8 million people in the United States that were supported by the WPA and knew that it was a good thing. And he worked for the Southern California Arts Project for the WPA in Southern California. The director was a fellow by the name of Stanton McDonald Wright. And my father posed for several major murals in California while he worked for the WPA as an administrator and an artist model. There's the largest freestanding mosaic tiled mural in Long Beach, California. It's the largest freestanding project, I think, that the Arts Project did in the United States. And he's the principal model for all of the male figures in that particular mural. And if you make it to Santa Monica, California someday and go to the public library in Santa Monica, there's a large mural in the library that was done by Stanton McDonald Wright. And my father was the fellow in over 60 of the images in that mural. And in Lafayette Park, the statue of Lafayette has his hands are holding the reins of a horse. Those hands are my dad's hands. So he had a wonderful, a wonderful time during the Depression. I'm really sorry but it was not very depressing. And he met my mother he was peddling some art for some of the New Deal artists that were out of the Southern Los Angeles Art Students League. And he was in Santa Barbara in an art gallery, and he was peddling this artwork and walked in with an arm full of paintings and was walking up a flight of stairs, and he tripped on a flight of stairs, and there was this young lady coming down, and she looked at him, and he said, "Hiya, Toots." That was the first words he said to my mother. She was a good-looking girl. Anyway, they married eventually in July of 1941, just before the beginning of the war, on July 26th. On July 25th, my grandfather, my mother's father, sent her a telegram: "Do not get married. I will send you a ticket. Just return home to St. Paul, and all is forgiven, but you're making a huge mistake." Well, she didn't listen to him. She was pretty headstrong. They got married, and 7 children later, we were living in 1957. That was our last year in the art studio. So 7 children later, I think my grandfather finally came around and realized that my dad was an okay guy. So my dad had a tough time in the book business, but eventually by the 1960s, I forgot one thing. My mother, because of her tenacity and because she was so determined that Henry Clausen was going to succeed in the book business, she went to work for the sheriff's department and became a deputy sheriff, and eventually the sheriff's chief secretary, and that kept the bookstore open. The reason why we stayed in business was because of my mother, and because of the way she took charge and she got a job. She kept body and soul together in the Clausen family. And my father thrived in the book business, particularly in the 60s and 70s. And he left me with one very important piece of advice. He said, "Never buy fiction." Thank you very much.